tutorial is brought to you by posebargain.com. 3D props at bargain prices. If you own ZBrush, you will most likely be familiar with a plugin called ZAppLink. This plugin allows you to use Photoshop in conjunction with ZBrush to aid you in your 3D texturing. But for those of you who can't afford ZBrush, or are not willing to use a pirated copy of ZBrush, there is a way of simulating the plugin in your native 3D program. For this example, I'll be using Lightwave, but you can use 3D Studio Max, Maya, Softimage, or any other high-end 3D programs. However, you will need to find a native equivalent to some of the things I do to get the technique to work the same way on your 3D program. Before I start, I should mention that this technique is a mix of two other techniques by two other artists. The first credit goes to Chris Costa, also known as Entropus, for his tutorial on using photos to paint textures in Projection Master in ZBrush. The second credit goes to Mark Snoswell for his tutorial on projection mapping, which can be found in the tutorial book Essence, The Face from Ballistic Publishing. It is rather an expensive book, but if you are serious about photorealistic faces, then it might be a good investment. We start off with the head that I created in Lightwave. Note that I haven't done any sculpting or refinement in ZBrush, so she lacks subtle details. It's important that the model you use for this technique has a UV map created for it. It took me a while, but I managed to get a proper UV map made. Make sure, however, that when you make your UV map, that you don't have any overlapping UVs. Otherwise, your resulting texture will come out weird. Because I was just going to texture my model, I saved out a frozen version of my model. This means that I turned off NURBS and subdivided the mesh a few times. Subdividing the mesh will also ensure that your texturing will come out more accurately. Once this was done, I loaded up my model in Layout. I don't like using the default setting for the camera zoom, so I changed it from 3.2 to 8. This gives me a less distorted view of my model. The skin surface has a plain white color, with diffuse, specularity and the other settings set to their default values. We're just going to go for a basic look, so there's no need for any fancy light or environment settings. From the camera view, it is important that the model is facing forward and that the area you want to texture fills up the view as much as possible. Making sure you have anti-aliasing on, because you don't want jagged edges, render out the image with a white background. Also, once you have rendered out the image, do not move the camera one bit. This is important if you want this technique to be successful. Once you are done, open up Photoshop. Here's the render which I have opened up in Photoshop. I rendered out the image at 1280 by 1024 so that I could have a decent resolution image to work with. A higher resolution is better, but there's no need to go insane with the size. Just stick to something higher that your computer can handle. Make a copy of the background layer and set it to multiply. Then, fill the original background layer with white. The top multiply layer will guide you in aligning your textures correctly. Now, create a blank layer above the white background layer. Rather than painting your texture by hand, we'll be using a photo, saving us a lot of time. Here's one I picked up from the 3DSK website. There are a lot of human reference texture packs online which you can buy to help you with your 3D, but I'm cheap, so we'll stick with the free stuff. Using the shaded layer as reference, manipulate the photo until it matches with the 3D shading. Don't worry if it's not perfect, because you can always fix things later. Use different tools to make the work easier. Use the liquify, clone stamp, warp, and other tools until you get a texture you like. For the purpose of this tutorial, I didn't do everything properly, so there are areas where the shading is wrong or not done, like with the ears for example. Once you have something decent, make the top shaded layer invisible so that all you get is just the basic flat coloring. Save out a copy of this flat shading and we go back into Lightwave. If you didn't move the camera like I said before, then this technique will work, otherwise you're screwed. Making sure you're in the camera view, open up the surface editor and click on the T next to the color settings. What we are now going to do is use the camera as a projection tool using the texture we created as the projected image. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's kind of dumb. Why not just planar map? Well, planar mapping is restricted to just 3 axes. Yes, you can resize and rotate your texture, but projection mapping through your camera allows you to texture your model from any angle. It even takes into consideration lens distortion. So, with your color settings open, make sure that it is set to image. Set your mapping type to front and make sure that the camera is set as your projector. If you're creative, you can use multiple cameras with textures from different angles in conjunction with alphas to get a full head texturing. Press Use Texture once you are done. If you have OpenGL textures and texture shading turned on, then you can see your model now has a texture. If you are to move your camera now, however, your texture will look offset. While this looks okay, we need to convert this texturing so that it is more permanent. And this is where baking comes in. For this, we need to use the plugin Surface Baker. This plugin allows us to take lighting and coloring information in Lightwave and turn it into an image based on our UV map. In the Shading tab of your skin surface, click on Add Shader and scroll down your plugin list until you get the Surface Baker plugin. Double-click the text to open up the Surface Baker options. These are the settings you will want to keep. Bake entire object, bake to image, and bake color. All the rest of the settings are up to you, but I suggest that you set your image resolution to something high so that all the detail of the transferred texture can be kept. I use 2048 by 2048. Even if I later decided that I wanted to use a smaller image for my head model, I could just shrink the resulting image so that the fine details are kept. Once you are done, close the window and render your image. While it renders your image, you should get a small progress bar which shows you the process of the image being baked. When the rendering finishes, go back into the surface settings and click on the T next to the color settings of your head surface. To see the result of our baking, change the mapping type from front to UV. Then select your UV map and the image that you just baked. Click Use Texture when you're done. Now, when you render your image, you will get the same shading as with the front projection mapping, except that this time you can move the camera around without the texture shifting. If you want to keep texturing the rest of the head, use the same technique but with other views such as the side, back, top, and 3/4 views. Save each baked texture under a different name, then composite the images in Photoshop to get rid of any seams so that it becomes one full seamless image. Before I go, I should note that this is not a perfect process. Sometimes you'll get strange distortions in your baked image, or warping, or whatever. If this happens, just experiment by trying slight camera offsets or angles before painting. You can sometimes just fix the distortions in Photoshop after you bake the images manually. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Remember that you don't need to limit yourself to just head and faces. You can use this technique for vehicles, trees, the ground, etc., etc. It can save you a lot of time, and it can make you look like a more professional texture artist. Good luck with your future 3D projects.